morning, I'll be reading from Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. "Teacher," they said, "we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked. They replied, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." "You don't know what you are asking," Jesus said. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared." When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as ransom for many."
Thank you, William. I wonder if you've ever heard of Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius of Antioch. He died on the 6th of July, either 107 or 108 AD, at about 73 years old. There's a lot of different traditions associated with Ignatius. One that seems somewhat possible is that he was personally a student of the Apostle John. Jesus' Apostle John, this is someone who was alive during the life of Christ, but tradition holds that he was someone who was John's personal disciple, personal student who had studied under him. I think a little harder to substantiate is another tradition that he was actually one of the children that Jesus blessed. You know, sometimes Jesus would take children in his arms, and Ignatius would have been about the right age to have potentially been him. But there's several different legends about Ignatius, but he was someone we know for sure of great stature in the early church over in the east in Antioch in Syria. Eventually he was arrested and sent to Rome, and they had him surrounded by numerous guards, and as they were transporting him to Rome, they went throughout Asia Minor, in much the way that the Apostle Paul, when he was in prison, would write letters to Christians in various places. There are also several letters that Ignatius wrote that we have available to us and are actually pretty interesting to read. But one of the letters that he wrote was to the church in Rome. Church tradition holds that he was eventually martyred in the Colosseum. Actually, they're in the Colosseum, most likely by wild animals that tore his body apart. But as he's getting ready to move towards Rome and he's traveling and he's en route, he writes this letter, and he's thinking about his impending death, which he believes is very near, and I think correctly so. I'd like to read you a portion of this letter as he describes some of the things he was anticipating. He doesn't instruct them to pray for his deliverance, but instead, much like the apostles in Acts, when they were up against the authorities, they just said, "Pray for my boldness. Pray that I'll stand strong. Pray that I do the thing I know that I'm supposed to do and that I won't back down from it." Listen to the words of Ignatius. He says, "Now as a prisoner, I am learning to give up my own wishes. All the way from Syria to Rome, I am fighting wild beasts by the land and by the sea, by day and by night. Chained as I am to 10 leopards, I mean the detachment of soldiers who guard me. The better you treat them, the worse they become. Because of their cruelty, I am more and more learning to be a true disciple. But not by this am I justified. How happy I will be with the beasts which are prepared for me. I hope that they will make short work of me. I shall even coax them to devour me quickly and not to be afraid of touching me, as sometimes happens. In fact, if they hold back, I shall force them to eat. Bear with me, for I know what is good for me. Now I am beginning to be a disciple. May nothing visible or invisible rob me of my price, which is Christ Jesus. The fire, the cross, packs of wild beasts, lacerations, rendings, wrenching of bones, mangling of limbs, crushing of the whole body, the horrible tortures of the devil, come what may, if only I may gain Jesus Christ." It's pretty intense, isn't it? I have to say, as a person, when I read this, I would think any Christian would want to be willing to give our life for Christ if we were called upon to martyrdom or to make that kind of sacrifice. But this is just my opinion. When I read Ignatius, to me, in that letter he writes to the Roman church, it almost gets a little sadistic, doesn't it? It's almost like he's really anticipating. But the one thing that is kind of majestic about the way that Ignatius gives his life is that there is this really clear line in the sand, isn't there? He absolutely knows why he's been imprisoned, why he's going to be executed, and what it is that he wants to do. And after his life, we pronounce him a martyr. We say, here's a person who gave his life for Christ. There's that clean line in the sand. What does it mean to really be a disciple, to give your life for Christ? So the passage that we're looking at this morning, it deals with James and John. And in Mark's account, it only mentions James and John. There's some other gospel accounts that mention their mother was actually with them asking for this favor. But this is coming right after a passage in Mark where Jesus has said, you know, the Son of Man's going to be handed over. I'm going to end up being crucified, but they're going to arrest me, they're going to mock me, they're going to spit on me and torture me and flog me, and then ultimately I'm going to be executed. It's after he's made that statement that James and John approach him, and there's that loaded question. I mean, this is a loaded question if ever there was one. Lord, will you say yes to whatever it is we ask you for? Wouldn't you love to be able to say that to Jesus sometime? God, I want to ask you a question, but will you go ahead and agree you have to say yes to whatever it is? That's what they do. Lord, we want to ask you for something, but you have to promise us you're going to say yes. He says, what is it? What do you want? And they say, well, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other sit on your left hand so that we can be participants in your glory. As you come in your glory, we want to be there on your right hand and your left hand. And he says, in essence, you guys have no idea what you're talking about. You really don't even have a clue what it is that you're asking for. And he uses a couple of metaphors. Can you really drink that cup that I'm preparing to drink? Can you undergo this baptism, this burial that I'm preparing for? Are you really ready to do that? Can you do that? And they say, we believe that we can. We believe that we're ready for that. And he says, well, eventually someone will be at my right hand and my left hand, but that's for those whom God has decided on. That's not for me now to decide. It's for those for whom this has been prepared. So you think about James and John in that exchange, and then imagine you were one of those other 10 disciples standing around. What would your reaction be? I mean, I think their reaction is what mine would have been. They got pretty angry about it. It is probably a bit complex as to what it was that made them angry. I mean, in some ways it's, who do these guys think they are? Who do you think you are asking for that kind of request? But if he's going to say yes, I kind of wish I would have thought of asking for it first, right? It's easy to kind of sit in the seat of judgment on them, but you're also going, man, that was kind of a good idea if he goes for it. So there's some tension between the disciples, and they're upset. But when they're thinking about Jesus and what it meant to follow Jesus, to drink the cup that he was drinking, I think they're imagining a Messiah much more like this image here. If we could go to that next slide. Have you ever seen that before? The idea of a superhero muscle Jesus. This is the Messiah that the Jews were really waiting for. That even if they tried to kill him, here's a guy who could pull himself off the cross, jump down, and start kicking everyone's tail. Swift uppercut to the Roman Empire. He was going to come back, be the Messiah, reestablish the Jewish kingdom, and everything was supposed to be great. So when they're asking this request, we want to be on your right hand and your left hand, they're thinking about Jesus Christ, the movie poster, where he might be flexing up front, but they're kind of flanking him on the sides like Charlie's Angels, right? They're wanting to kind of get in on the glory. They're thinking about all these powerful pictures of him coming and conquering, wanting some of that glory by proximity. A lot of times, even as we approach God and say, God, I want to do something for you, or I want to humble myself for you, there's still some way that we're hanging on to that desire for glory. One of my favorite Peanuts comic strips is this conversation between Charlie Brown and Linus. And Linus says, I think when I grow up, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to be a humble little country doctor. You ever seen that one? I just want to be a humble little country doctor. And he starts talking about what he thinks that means. He says, well, Charlie Brown, I'll be this humble doctor out in the country. But, of course, you see, I'll live in the city. But every morning I'll get up and I'll hop in my sports car and I'll zip out there to the country. And then I'll just start healing people. I'll heal them one after another, and they'll be coming from miles around out there to the country where I'll heal them, and then I'll head home again. And he exclaims in the last frame of that comic strip, I'll be a world-famous, humble little country doctor. Isn't so often that the way we kind of think about humility? I want to be a servant, but I kind of want to be noted for how well I serve. I want to be humble, but I really want everyone to know about how humble I am. It's always a struggle, isn't it? Because the moment you think you can say, I've now become humble, you've kind of lost it, haven't you? Humility is a tricky thing to lay hold of. So what does it mean for us when we think about giving our life for Christ, or to use Jesus' words, picking up our cross and following after him? What does it look like for us to drink the cup? What does humility look like? What does it lead us to do? I think that's ultimately portrayed in Christ Jesus, though there are a couple of portraits in Scripture along the way that I find to be very instructive. One of them is in Exodus chapter 32, and this is the episode where, Moses has gone up on Mount Sinai, and he's got to be away for a few days because he's face to face with God, and God is giving him the law. He's taken them out of slavery. It's this act of grace and mercy and salvation. He's protected them from the Egyptian armies. He's made them wealthy because they were able to plunder the Egyptians as they left. The Egyptians just gave them gold and possessions and jewels. And so they left, having been slaves, they left as a wealthy nation. But meanwhile, Moses has gone up to get the law from God to describe what that society was supposed to be like. Because after all, if God saves you, he does have a right to tell you what you ought to do with this life that you've been spared. And so God is giving Moses the law, and meanwhile, you remember the story. We haven't even known this Moses guy all that long. Why don't we make us a big golden calf? And we can say, these are the gods. This is the God who delivered us from Egypt. And so as Moses starts coming down the mountain with Joshua, they start hearing noises, and they talk about, is there some kind of a war going on? Is there a battle? And Moses says, no, that's not what battles sound like. It sounds like they're having a big party down there. And sure enough, they had built this enormous golden calf, and Moses gets so angry. Those tablets that God had written on with his own hand, he takes them and smashes them, and he exacts some pretty severe punishment on the people for what they've done. I wanted to read you this next passage, though, from Exodus chapter 32 and verse 30. It says, the next day Moses said to the people, you have sinned a great sin. And now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. So Moses returned to the Lord and said, alas, this people has sinned a great sin. They've made for themselves gods of gold. But now, if you will forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. You catch the gravity of that statement? Please forgive these people, and if you won't, just snuff me out with them. Moses is willing to have his own name erased from the book of life for the sake of these people that he's trying to lead. Of course, God's response is a very sensible one. It's the one we would want. Well, of course, I'm not going to punish you for something you didn't do. I'm going to hold people accountable for their own actions. But just the same, when we think about a path to true humility, it has to be something that looks like Moses' heart here in this situation. He's been leading these people, and they are stiff-necked and stubborn and willfully ignorant and rebellious and difficult, but just the same, Moses is able to say, God, these are the people that you have given me to love, and despite everything about them, I do love them. We need to be that way with our brothers and sisters in Christ. It's not always easy working with people. Some people get on our nerves, they bother us, they do things we don't like, but in the end, we can say as the church, these are the people God has given us to love. The people who come through our doors. These are the people that God has given us to love. So let's love them. The people at your workplace, the people on your kids' ball teams, the people that you encounter from day to day, these are the people that God has given you to love. Start praying for those people. I've heard some inspiring stories from some of you, in fact, about, I've got this prayer list. I have a prayer journal, and I write down the names of people I know, just praying that one day they'll become a Christian. And you'd be amazed how many times after I've prayed for them 6 months, 2 years, sure enough, God opens that door and they finally decide to walk through it. But we really need to work at loving the people that we actually do have around us. I'm sure it would have been so nice for Moses to be able to say, well, these guys are losers, give me a new people to lead. But instead, Moses loved the people that God had put under his care, and I think he expects us to do the same. That's at least part of the path to humility. I also think about John the Baptist. In the passage that William read for us, Jesus is talking about how Gentiles love to lord authority over people. They want to be great and exercise their greatness, but he says, not so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. In our culture, we're so obsessed with things going viral. You know, this 15 minutes of fame that everyone wants to have. You know, I was in Mardell a few days ago, the Christian bookstore. Y'all remember Chewbacca Mom from last year? You know, that lady got a book deal. You know, she made this YouTube video with her kid's Chewbacca mask, and she just laughed. And it is a really pleasant thing, but sure enough, yeah, she happens to be a Christian, and some Christian publishing company gave that lady a book deal. And we kind of look at it and say, that's the key. That's what I've got to find. I have to find my own Chewbacca mask, and then I get a book deal. And then people want to pay attention to me. You know, we think about this path to greatness. But John the Baptist was always a wilderness preacher. People traveled out to see him in hundreds. People would come because they wanted to hear his teachings. But John made it very clear. John did not think of himself as a destination. He thought of himself as a compass. Jesus is the destination. I am pointing people towards Jesus. It is not about me. It is all about him. When you come to me, if you appreciate anything about me, you need to be looking at this guy because I'm not even worthy to untie or to tie his shoes. This is the one you should be looking at. We as Christians, we're not the destination. We're like a compass pointing people towards the true destination. I love John's attitude that when he thought about Jesus, he says, you know, I'm not the protagonist in my own story. God is busy doing things. That's true for us too. In our story, in my story, Mark is not the protagonist. It's not about us. It's about God and what God is doing. And when we make ourselves available to God, the things that he can do. Because after all, when you look at all the problems in the world, and my goodness, with the news headlines this week, we've got some real problems in our world. It's not going to be our brilliance or our insights that fix everything in the world. Only God's love is going to be able to accomplish that. We got to do what we can, but in the end, it is the love of God that people need to come to understand, that they need to experience so they can find a better path in this life. So realistically, I'm probably never going to be torn apart by wild animals like Ignatius. I don't think you will be either, at least not for the sake of the kingdom. I'm probably not going to have my head chopped off like John the Baptist, and probably never going to have to do any of the things that Moses did in his experience. So I ask that question again for us. What does it mean for us normal people in our regular lives to pick up our cross and follow Jesus? What is this cup that we are to drink from? What is the way that we pour out our lives? I would contend that our cup is ministry. The cup that God asks us to drink from, the way that God asks us to pour out ourselves for the glory of God, for the strengthening of the people of God, it has to do with these simple acts of ministry, doing all the things that we can do. You know, there are some people in history, and even in our time, there are martyrs all around the world being killed for their faith. When you think about drinking the cup for Jesus, there are some people who go through some horrible event like many of the apostles did, or like Ignatius did, where they have to kind of chug down that cup of self-sacrifice all at once. You know, I was listening to a preacher named Fred Craddock who was talking about how he used to think about, how is it that I'm going to give my life for Christ? You know, what am I going to do? How am I going to give my life for Christ? And he says, I would get this romanticized picture in my head. And I would imagine myself, and I'd been arrested, and I was looking rough, and my clothes were tattered and torn, and they backed me up against this wall. And the firing squad is all lined up in front of me, and their leader says to me, you have one last chance. Will you deny Christ? And I'd say, never. And they would offer me a blindfold, and I'd refuse the blindfold, and say, just do what you will. And so then the leader, he drops his hand, and then shots are fired, and then in slow motion, you know, the body begins slumping down to the ground. And then you fast forward like 200 years later, and there's a mom and dad and their 2.5 kids who are walking by that same location, and they say, can you see the bullet holes in the wall? You see a little bit of blood stain that's still there, because see, that's where he gave his life for Christ. We kind of think in those large-scale romantic terms. Some of us do drink down that cup very swiftly in how we give ourselves for Christ. But for a lot of us, I think it's more like my friend Joyce Grayson. When I was a child, at our congregation, just like at King's Crossing, we had a ministry of delivering communion to shut-ins. And I would tell those of you who are parents, if you are not doing this and are not bringing your children along to have these experiences, they are really missing out on something. I have so many profound ways that I was shaped as a child, because very often I would accompany my dad to visit people whose health was in very bad condition, whose memories were failing, uncomfortable situations, and a lot of things I saw as a child that still impact me as an adult. But there was a couple named John and Joyce Grayson, and they were just such a joy. Me and my buddies in Sunday school class would talk about, whose dad has communion rotation tonight. Oh, do you guys get the Graysons? Oh, man, I wish I got the Graysons this week. They were so friendly and so positive and just so happy that you were there. And it was better than going to Olive Garden because they would always give you your whole own packet of those little Andes mint chocolate things, right? So we loved them. And that was the reason part of why we loved them, right? But they were so good. But John had a severe stroke. Late 60s, early 70s, he had a severe stroke. He was no longer able to walk, couldn't dress himself, couldn't feed himself. He could say two things. He could say, yep, and then he had this other gibberish thing that he would mutter. And anything else he tried to say besides yep just came out as gibberish. He lost his ability to speak. And I remember over the years as we would go back and would see them and visit them, how Mrs. Grayson was always so in love with her husband and continued little by little to serve him and to take care of him. We take communion in these little sippy cup things. And sometimes I think for us in our setting, that might be the most appropriate metaphor for how we should think about the way we give our life for Christ now. Not in a big gulp, not in a bucket, not in a rapid pouring out, but just a little bit at a time. I imagine if God had spoken to Joyce all the mornings of her life after John had that stroke, that they might have had a conversation. He would say to her, Joyce, would you be willing to love John again today the way that you loved him yesterday? Would you help bathe him? Would you help him get dressed? Would you feed him now since he can't feed himself? And I think of each day her taking that little sip and saying, yes, Lord, I'll still do that one more time. Gladly so. Gladly so. Little by little is how we're going to be poured out for Christ. And I think this is what we're really talking about when we're talking about ministry. All the different booths you see out here in the lobby and in the fellowship room, all the people you're going to talk to, these are some of the ways that little by little we're trying to say to the Lord, Lord, you may call on me to make one big grand sacrifice. And Lord, I pray for the strength to do that if I'm ever called on to do that. But for now, Lord, I do want to give my life for you, and I'm willing to do it just a little bit at a time. Little by little, not necessarily in one grand swoop, but little by little, I'm going to continue saying yes to God. And each day as we serve, we say, God, here's this little piece of me that I give to you. Because, when I think about Joyce Grayson, she passed away a couple of years ago, but when I think about Joyce and how many years she cared for her husband, I think I could truthfully say that Ignatius gave his life for Christ. But don't you try and convince me that she didn't do the very same thing. It looked different, but the sacrifice is just the same. It's a heart condition, isn't it? It's a matter of having that servant heart, that I love the people God has given me, that I look for the interests of others above myself, that God has got to become greater, He's got to increase, I need to decrease. And I put ministry above all things because this is how I drink that cup that Jesus drank for us. As you think about your life this morning, if you've never made that commitment to Christ in baptism and named Him as your Lord, if you've been holding back and not giving to God the things that you could be giving or doing the things that you could be doing, we want to see you make that commitment. We want to see you have a good and abundant life that comes from walking with the Lord. But if there's some way this morning that you need to make a commitment or just ask for prayer or there's anything we could do to assist you, this is a time that you could come forward and let us know what your needs are. We would invite you to, while together we stand and sing.